talking about long-term romance.
What?
And some of the pitfalls that your typical relationship, the things that I've seen when doing relationship and intimacy coaching that come up, and when people kind of go from that early days of romance and then they kind of fall into the routine, and then all of a sudden in the long term, romance always dies, is what I always hear.
Absolutely.
And I do not believe in that.
And there's also, I think that could be a great place to start, and then we'll jump into the long-term romance. But why does short-term romance fizzle out? Like, let's start there.
Well, let's start off how it typically starts.
Yeah.
Normally there's this whole kind of discovering of the other person. There's all
Can't
this excitement.
sleep.
Precisely.
I literally, I remember a certain day, I'm up all night just thinking about the person, and it's and every time they would text me or be near me, just this craziness that it would overcome me.
Well, from a neurochemical standpoint, you have lowered levels of serotonin that drop during those first 7 months of being crazy in love. The late Dr.
Right?
Helen Fisher, would look at patients who talked about this deep, intense, young love, and would then look at people who were neurotic and notice that their levels of serotonin were approximately the same.
Okay.
And actually,
but maybe that's an important thing.
Completely. And if you were then to look at it from an evolutionary biological perspective, this feeling is what is going to get you to fixate on a partner to basically procreate.
Right.
And where adrenaline is going to kind of create all that excitement to just get you to mate, the other one, the lower levels of serotonin, increased levels of dopamine, is get you to fixate on the other person, which is what we talk about. But the body isn't really, just from a physiological state, able to
not sustainable.
Sustain that.
Yeah, it's not sustainable.
Not healthy.
I need to sleep.
Precisely. But then also from a perspective of the psychology, and this is a part that I think isn't spoken about, because then if you go just to biology, it's like, oh, okay, well, then that means you can't sustain it, therefore it's going to fizzle out, and everyone's going to get the 7-year itch, and go off and get a new partner, or just
you
be
just
in
have
a
people
relationship
who are
kind of dead
chronically addicted to that phase, and that's why a lot of relationships are not lasting more than half a year at this point.
Which is called serial monogamy.
Okay.
Which, if you look at the book by Denis de Rougemont, the Love in the Western World, he says a person like that is not really in love with the other person, they're in love with being in love.
Yeah, because they like the high that they're feeling.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, the way that I break it down, and the way that I understand this in a way that can be very practical for people to get, is that if you think about this kind of springtime of the relationship, there's the flowers are blossoming, and this is the discovery of each other, same way that the petals unfurl and you get to see what had been in these bulbs has been in the earth, and it's really fascinating. And so you're discovering all these truths about each other, and you're sharing them, and you're finding how the two of you are so similar, and you literally start to idealize the person. And a lot of times you maybe even have had an ideal of what is the perfect person for you, and you start to interpret them within that lens. And then as time goes on, you start to go, oh wait, they're not really that ideal. And I was more in love with that ideal than the actual person. And then you start to fall out of love. The other way is that maybe you just continue to keep that idealized state of them, but you've literally boxed them in to this truth, of what you were, and maybe they were actually that way at the beginning, but now 20 years later, a person starts to change, and yet you're still in love or trying to connect to this other person, and before you know it, one day you kind of go, you know what? Do we actually know each other?
I've seen this with psychedelically induced
love. That's
so there was a couple that I knew that's in our industry, and they teach a lot, and one of their things that they kept advocating was this moment when they met and they met the beloved, and they were in an altered state when they met
Yes.
the beloved. And then I witnessed the entirety of their relationship revolves around that one moment when they met the beloved, and the attempt to recreate the magic of that. And in reality, what I was witnessing wasn't always very beloved-like.
Yes.
But there was almost cognitive dissonance. They didn't want to look at the things that weren't working, and were always just very much romanticizing that goal of like, we are beloveds and we are really into each other.
So, note to all of you out there, if you see a Tantra fall in love, have the perfect couple relationship course, and you find out that, they are teaching this course because they just met 2 weeks ago at Burning Man.
Yeah, some party.
Get ready for the follow-up course, which is on about the conscious breakup course, tantric breakup course,
we see it all
which
the
kind of
time.
happens about 3 months later.
Yeah, we see it all the time. It's
or even
amazing.
sometimes weeks.
Or also, you see some couples, they'll cycle through. They'll like be madly in love. It's the most extraordinary love of their entire life, and then all of a
Yes.
sudden, it's like the worst thing, and it's the just death. And then suddenly they circle back, and they're like, "Well, actually, this is the best thing that ever," because they do the loop, but with each other. And then eventually it just doesn't work out. So why we're talking today, though, why I'm really excited, and it was something you brought up to me a few years ago. Actually, when we first met, I was just trying to discover about your work, especially you'd written a thesis and you'd done a lot of research, and I was super curious. I mean, I remember hours of discussion around this topic, and you specifically were looking at attachment stuff,
Yes.
and you've only found a tiny handful of papers that actually address long-term
Yes.
romance, which I would really love you to define this a little bit, because in the collective mind, there's no such thing.
Well, I mean, I literally went through around 1,000 papers on everything related to attachment theory, and also not just childhood attachment theory, but specifically adult romantic attachment theory. So this was a lot of stuff from like Hazan and Shaver, not just Bowlby and Ainsworth. And then, I mean, there's a myriad of people then who have studied this. And so in those papers, I literally found, I think it was 3 papers
Wow.
that addressed long-term romance.
Were you surprised when you saw that term?
I was happy to, because ultimately what I was proposing in my thesis, as opposed to looking at people as this is your type, which they talk about as like a conditioned conditioned attachment theory, meaning that whatever happens to you as a child then
Prepares
continues.
you for da-da-da?
It influences then and is the way that you are actually typed, and you cannot break out of it
You're in the
for
box.
adult romantic attachment. And then it has effects with family life, and you're just, if you're avoidant, you're forever avoidant. If you're anxious, you're forever anxious. And I was looking at, well, how can we actually start to be conditioned differently? Because it isn't the case that a person could have been securely attached as a child, but then have a horrible dating experience that then makes them avoidant in the romantic realm, but with
That
their
might have been
family, with their family, and with friends, etc. They don't have that. Or it could be the opposite too. Maybe they're securely attached in romantic relationships, but with friends, they're actually quite avoidant. And so I was looking at the impact of the environment and history and the context in which you are operating. If you go to a club and you're having a party, your behaviors have a tendency to be more avoidant. Even if your baseline is, let's say, anxious or securely attached, because you're playing a lot of the games of who's above and who's below, and whereas if you then are in like a candlelit, very intimate type of setting, then it's natural that there's going to be more kind of romantic feelings, to the point that certain types will actually avoid those areas because it actually fights against the way that they prefer
Right.
to be meeting people. So the environment has an important factor. And so what they noticed was that when it came to long-term romance, which, by the way, the people that were interviewed, when they said, well, do you miss the early days of romance? They're like, no, actually, it was quite exhausting. We still have all of these deep sense of reverence and connection, but we're getting good sleep. We don't have the anxiety that comes with, oh, are they going to leave or not, because they've developed that stability. And so there's that commitment there. And this is where I see secure attachment as a much more dynamic attachment ability, as opposed to just,
It can fluctuate,
I mean, the other part that you'd see hardly any papers written on was secure attachment. It was always looking at the dysfunctional imbalance.
Well, that's the nature of how most people like to look at things.
Which means, though, then that they thought of secure as like, oh no, it's just a healthy, happy, static relationship, as opposed to, no, having the versatility in one's relationship, the ability to have the romantic side, which is, associated with anxious attachment, but also to have that lustful, taking, dominant, or like game playing. I think the Greek word for it is ludus, which is like gameplay. That's like there's like a winner, there's a taker, there's like that kind of charge that you find in those early flirtation times. Having that in a securely attached, longer term relationship keeps a charge there. And so the factors that they found was that, one, they were having a shared hobby.
That's fun.
Which, what is a hobby? It's something that you can go out and explore and be curious with. And the other one was that they had times of being playful with one another. So the way that then I boiled this down is, if you can have an activity where you are both curious and explore each other as well as something else outside of yourself, that then is going to kind of allow you to see how that person interacts, and you can do it in a playful way, then this was literally just the very simple key foundation to keeping that romantic feelings, those romantic feelings alive for the long term. And this is, if you can then take that and apply that to sex and the way that you are exploring each other, being curious with each other, finding a playfulness in that sexual experience, while having it be your hobby of becoming more and more masterful at enjoying one another, what better recipe then for actually keeping long-term romance alive?
I would say that's true in the couples I've observed. I'm very intimately connected with some couples very successfully together for a very, very long time.
Yes.
And they seem still, like, something, one of them I think is over 30 years, the other's over 50 years. And they seem still intrigued by each other.
Yes.
Still excited to see each other, go on adventures together. They still seem like, kind of have that sexy vibe towards each other. They can't get enough. And so that's why I believe in it, only because I've witnessed it. Now, it does take a little bit of effort because the inertia or the social conditioning that this doesn't exist, all the pain and dysfunction that people are imprinted with, then there is a skill set, which is why I wanted to have this conversation with you, because I find how you coach the couples that we work with and the principles you bring in, they're really helpful. And not only that, in our own relationship, I see you embodying, like walking your talk. And it's the first time in my life I've had a relationship of this, I'd say, caliber. And so I feel there's a resonant truth because you live it yourself, and then you also, support others to live it as well, which is really important to me. But before we get into that, I'd love you could you define for us what is intimacy? And then I also want your definition of what is embodied love, because I hear you speak, we need to embody love more.
So intimacy comes from the Latin word intimare, which means to impress, to leave an impression upon. So if you were to think of like a relief and you were to push your hand into clay, it leaves an imprint there. So if you then think about every interaction that you have with a person, you are creating an impression upon them of who you are, who they are, and who the two of you are in relation to one another. And this is important because it is an ongoing impression. And if the impression that you have, or the idealization you have of this is the perfect mold of the person that I'm to be with, I've now made them match that. But then as the relationship goes on and they kind of fall further away from it, there's dissonance between the two of those.
Exactly.
So the ability to continuously create impressions and the ability to interpret them and understand one another is what is going to create a healthy relationship. Now, I do have a cycle of the components of what actually makes for intimacy that then I teach to couples so that way they can literally continually develop a intimacy that is positive. Because the other thing about intimacy is, and you'll hear about it as some people, the most intimate relationship they have is with an enemy.
Yeah.
Meaning that the person who's made the strongest impression on their life isn't a positive one, it's a negative one. And you hear about that, about the closeness of enemies, like when they're fighting in a war, you know, and I mean, you even will see it sort of with like high school boys sometimes. They will fight, and then once they've resolved it, they become great friends.
Yeah.
You're like, how did that end up happening? It's because they've actually shared something deeply true. They've, as opposed to just holding it back, and they were able to take each other in that way, and all of a sudden then they create a great relationship from it. It's not what I'm saying is the way to go about creating a good relationship, but this is really important, which then brings me to the other part, which is embodied love. And you hear about lovemaking. This is how the question came to my mind, because not everyone says the word fucking or, you know, have sex. You'll hear it romantically said, oh, I want to make love. I'm like, okay, that sounds nice, but what is that love that you're making? Like, okay, if you're making something, then you're making love. So how do you actually embody that love?
Yes.
And what I mean is that then if you think about one of the deepest ways that you can literally impress upon which create an impression, which is intimacy then, is that sexual acts, and especially the sexual act of penetration, of you're entering somebody, you're being entered, you are also open with your psyche, your mind, your psychology is deeply being impressed upon. So if we can think about the embodiment of love, it is the question of like, okay, so then how in the act of love can we actually create and transmit this feeling of that is going to create deeper intimacy, deeper impressions that will then lead towards long-term romance, as opposed to it leading to a rather stale relationship. And I think Steinberger's triangle that he talks about of love being lust, romance, and commitment, and wanting to have something in that middle of the triangle with all of those aspects, because if you just are lustful, then you know you're kind of heading more towards just the lovers who have the one night stand, versus romance, which is this kind of idealized state of the other person, which if that goes too far, then you sort of lose connection to the everyday person. And if all your relationship does is become commitment, you sort of slip more towards friendship, you know, your partners and friendship. And I think that the way that you have sex actually then starts to bring you to those different areas. Like, can you have sex that is actually bringing forward those shared visions and inspiring you both to step into the shared values and visions that you have of what you're building your relationship on, whether it might be kids or business or whatever, you know, those shared values are? Or is it you're kind of having that like hard, rougher, fiery sex, something that some would call fucking, that is lustful, that creates those flames of passion? But if it's only that, then maybe you're not really like sensing into the other person, or having that feeling of this is the perfect person for me, oh my god, like they're just incredible, and then feeling that sense of deep oneness, then that's going to bring forward those more romantic feelings. And so the ability to have sex in a way that you can feel the two of yourselves as separate units, like just really having great sensation, or the sensation of having this oneness, and then this ability to feel that sex is actually building towards something even more than yourselves, is how I speak about embodying love and maintaining a great balance that is going to create that foundation of a relationship that is going to have an arc that will last a lifetime of both being curious, exploring, and playful, and discovering one another
Yeah,
over and over
I
again.
feel like, I mean, a big part of the work that we're doing now, especially combining section sex with a lot of the stuff I'm doing, it gives a landscape and an education and an access to the erotic intelligence that really allows couples to continuously be on this amazing adventure together. And when it's good, really like understanding and enjoying, like, oh wow, this is really amazing, and acknowledging that. And when there's challenges, rather than suddenly making up a story like, well, this is over now, we have a challenge, like this is no good.
Yes.
Actually being able to lean in, and in that facet of embodied love, which there are, I think there's four, you mentioned earlier, four components. I'd love to list those in this part of the podcast, and then I want to go deeper into them in the explicit. But just so people can get an idea, like, what is this? Because what I find is there's a brilliance to it. When we've brought it to my community, like the students that I have, they are still talking about these four elements and how important they are. Even though some of them, their partners want nothing to do with anything, the fact that one person is adhering and understanding of that has actually supported their relationship to improve.
Whether you want to see that it's there or not, it's sort of like physics. There's a certain dynamics that happen, and this isn't any like kink or any type of like thing out there that, you know, like a person is trying to like bring into a relationship. It's just a part of what's naturally there. And actually, I would also say that kinks, by the way, are just a part of our own psychology if we have the curiosity to look into it. But the cycle, and it originally started as this idea that there's different seasons in a relationship. And so you have a spring, you have a summer, you have a fall, and you have a winter.
And then a spring again.
And then a spring again. With that, you understand that there's a cycle. This is cyclical, it's not just linear. Intimacy, in the same way, is also cyclical and not just a linear progression.
Yes.
That then most people think of intimacy as literally a frozen moment in time that never changes, and it has lots of candle lights and maybe a fireplace if you have that luxury and whatever, and rose petals, but it's literally a frozen moment.
But you could have all of that and still not feel intimate. So
Precisely. Or you can have it as just this memory that you had, but it kind of becomes a ghost when you then finally, and these typically you'll fall out of love, where you're just like, I can't stand this person here because they are so far from the person that I was. And so then you look again for it and you get caught in the loop of the ideal. So these four components are truth, the ability to, which you see like in the earlier parts of the relationship, you're discovering all these new things about each other. Well, when you then share your truth, then the other person is able to be responsible, able to respond to that. And so you share something with the person and then they go, oh my gosh, that's incredible. You know what? I actually do this as well. And then they share back, oh my goodness, I love that you have that also. And so then you end up having trust that starts to get built between each other. Oh my gosh, we're the same. And then you go, yay. And then that's the celebration. So truth, responsibility, trust, celebration. And then when you have that experience of celebration, you then allows for deeper truths to be revealed, etc., etc. Now, in a healthy relationship, as those truths get deeper, as opposed to just being frozen as one moment in time, you start to discover all the layers to the person, and the relationship gets better. Or, and why a lot of people don't go into the long-term romance, is that idealized moment, which they actually are more in love with than the actual person in front of them. They start to discover truths that don't fit with that idealized part, and then
they're not responsible.
It breaks the trust, and then you go into pain, anguish, and then that ends up happening until you then end up separating.
Yeah.
Now, the key to this, and in embodied love, how does one actually embody love in the act of love making, is the ability to express your truth while having sex, meaning like, this feels good, this doesn't feel good. The other person is able to respond to that, and then that creates deeper bodily trust between each other, which allows for that relaxation as well as that excitement to go into orgasm, which then reveals deeper truth, and then so that's how it all connects.
Seen sex and sex do
precisely. And so this really is about attunement, and it is an understanding of the schema of what intimacy is. So how does one make an impression upon each other, and then you can understand, well, what kind of impressions am I making? Is it that there's not enough truth? Is there's not enough responsibility? Is there a block around the trust? Because some people, they go, oh, wow, they've told me this truth. Oh my goodness, they're responding to it. I really feel these emotions coming up. I can't trust that, because this cycle also is an internal one.
Yeah.
Can we be truthful with ourselves, responsible to ourselves, trust ourselves, and then actually celebrate that, which gets thrown off in different ways depending if you have a more anxious or avoidant, or you also have the anxious ambivalent, which is a combination of the two.
Well, let's jump into the explicit, because I'd like to go into how can we, with each of the 4 components, do that with a little bit more mastery and sensitivity.
Okay. To join us for the complete and explicit version of the podcast, simply upgrade your membership and gain instant access.